Sup, freaks? It's your boy Marty here to introduce this episode of Tales from the Crypt. And the immense pleasure of sitting down with Pete Rizzo, currently the editor-in-chief at Kraken, but we sat down in this episode to talk about a piece he wrote for Bitcoin Magazine in conjunction. He wrote this piece with Aaron Van Weerdum, the great Aaron Van Weerdum, one of the best technical writers in the Bitcoin space. They decided to dive into the history of Bitcoin, particularly around the P2SH, pay to script hash upgrade that happened towards the end of 2011, beginning of 2012. Very interesting story, very important, pivotal moment in Bitcoin's history that you guys should understand. Price is going crazy this week. Everybody's got their bull suits on, their moon suits on, space suits, ready to go to the moon. How the hell did we get here? What happened before we got to this point? What allowed us to get to this point? What decisions were made in the past? Critical decisions, critical conversations, and that dictated the philosophy of the development of the Bitcoin protocol. So we talked about that. We talked about journalism, podcasting, a bunch of other stuff. Really enjoyed this episode with Pete Rizzo. Very excited that he's able to pursue this type of work. We talked about that too. He was the editor-in-chief at CoinDesk for quite a while, pumping out articles every day. Now he's able to take a step back and actually focus on some long-term, timeless content that he's happy to be working on. I'm happy that he's able to work on these pieces because I think they're very important. This episode is brought to you by our good friends at the motherfucking Cash App. What up, hot girl Meg? Welcome to the team. Texted with her last night when you come on the Cash App team. We all get your number. So I was talking with the Stallion last night. She gave up $1 million worth of Bitcoin. That may still be going on. But yeah, she's on the stacking sats bandwagon. And Cash App allows you to stack sats, send sats, receive sats, sell sats if you so please. You can DCA in the sats. They've made sats the standard. They just initiated a Bitcoin boost that lets you get sats back when you use your boost card. Sats are taking over the Cash App. What are sats, you may be asking? You may be new to Bitcoin. The price may have drawn you into this podcast. Welcome. Sats are known as Satoshis. And a Satoshi Nakamoto is the founder and inventor of Bitcoin. I guess he's the inventor. Yeah, I guess, yeah. But the smallest denomination, the smallest unit of a Bitcoin is known as a Satoshi or a sat. There are 100 million sats in one Bitcoin. You get 100 million sats, you have one Bitcoin. All right, now sats are the standard within the Cash App. Like I said, you could DCA in the sats if you want it. What's DCA? Dollar cost average. You can set it and forget it. And by daily, weekly, bi-weekly, you can do that via the Cash App. On top of that, they have slivers of stonks that you can invest in if you want to. You can buy as little as $1 of a stonk if you're into the stock market and that type of stuff. And they're doing great things beyond that. Cash App can be your bank account. Get your paychecks direct deposited into the app. They have account numbers and routing numbers for users. Get your paycheck, stack sats. It's taking over, baby. The sats back Bitcoin boost. Used it this week. Works flawlessly. And it's addicting. That's all I'll say. If you haven't downloaded the Cash App yet, make sure you do. And when you do, use the code STACKINGSATS. That's STACKINGSATS. You're going to get $10, and $10 is going to go to our good friends at Owls Lacrosse. That's Owls Lacrosse. Woo! 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 Use the code STACKINGSATS. $10 is going to go to Owls Lacrosse. Stack those sats. 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 Enjoy this episode.
You've had a dynamic where money's become freer than free.
If you talk about a Fed just gone nuts, all the central banks going nuts.
So it's all acting like safe haven.
I believe that in a world where central bankers are tripping over themselves to devalue their currency, Bitcoin wins. In the world of fiat currencies, Bitcoin is the victor.
I mean, that's part of the bull case for Bitcoin.
If you're not paying attention, you probably should be.
What's up, freaks? Just Ninja launched the record button because we're having a good conversation already. Sitting down with Pete Rizzo, editor at Kraken. Is that how I'm introducing you?
Yeah, I'm appearing this more as the advisor to Bitcoin Magazine, or an advisor to Bitcoin Magazine, and a longtime industry journalist and writer. But my day job is at Kraken, the cryptocurrency exchange. So.
Yeah. Yeah, we were talking about an email exchange we had over 3 years ago at this point about me wanting to work at CoinDesk.
A young Marty Bent, fresh-faced, cheeks as rosy as snow, from what I can remember.
Yes. No, I'm battered. And no, it's funny. It's it'd be interesting to see what that path would be like, or even if that path was possible considering my writing style.
I imagine you'd look just like Frank Chaparro. You'd have a mustache. And you'd have like a nice lapel going. You'd have a number of pocket squares. Because you really, when you're on that beat, you can't have much Bitcoin flair. You really gets like ties, socks, and pocket squares.
Yeah, and you have to start out some tweets with scoop and all caps.
Right. There's a whole rigmarole to it, right?
Yeah. No, that's what we were just discussing. Am I a journalist? I don't think so. I journal. I definitely journal in the sense that I write every day about what's going
I think
on.
so. Yeah, I prefer a more permissive definition of journalism. So one of the things that's kind of come together over the last few months is there is an association of cryptocurrency journalists and researchers that has kind of come together to start talking about these subjects. A loose affiliation of people who otherwise probably wouldn't talk to each other. But it's been fun, and I think one of the interesting things I've tried to advocate for journalism is, I think people with audiences who don't consider themselves journalists end up defaulting to considering themselves journalists in some way, because you ultimately have a responsibility to an audience, right? And I think journalism, if you could think about it as a mental model for the world, right? It's a tool or a discipline. And why do tools and disciplines evolve? Because usually there's some nugget of utility there that perseveres through time. So journalism, if you really want to abstract it, is really about maintaining your contract with the audience, right? So you have an audience. There's some way you maintain that contract with it, right? You set the contract and then you maintain it. And I think you know that probably because when deciding guests or deciding topics and questions, you're conscious of that audience. So I think journalism, if you take it like way 10,000 foot view, it tries to set down a set of tactics and guidelines for how you should approach a situation like that. It used to be that was predicated on journalists and media outlets having a monopoly on information publishing and distribution. Not so much anymore, but I think that the values still apply. And I'm actually encouraged to hear people like, maybe yourself or Peter McCormick or others who sort of don't call themselves journalists, but still use journalism tactics. Because to me, that just says, like, the tactics are still good, right? So whether or not you're defending journalism, there's just utility to that mindset, and that mindset will likely live on even if media outlets as we know it today change drastically.
Yeah, I certainly feel obligated and a sense of responsibility to be giving the freaks some good information, especially what I cover. But Matt and I talk about this a lot, like you just alluded to. There's a new wave of media coming. It's been coming for quite a while due to podcasting and Twitter and personal blogs. But I think what you said, obviously I'm not like the pocket square buttoned up journalist, and I think that's actually, I like that. And Matt and I say this a lot, like, new wave is people with a bias but being open with that bias and stating that in the beginning. Like, Marty's bent, I have the definition of what I believe bent to be, my inclination or what I think. And
right.
Just being open with that bias, like, hey, I'm a Bitcoin bull. I believe in this technology. And here is Bitcoin information through my lens, what I'm looking at and what I think you may get value from.
Yeah, very cool. Hopefully we can do the audience some good stuff today.
Yeah. No, I think what you're doing right now, digging into Bitcoin history, is extremely important. It was actually the first 2 episodes of this podcast. I felt the need to start Tales from the Crypt by going back and doing Bitcoin history. So we have Bitcoin history part 1 and part 2. Didn't get in depth with P2SH like you and Aaron Van Weerdum did in this piece for Bitcoin Magazine, but I too am a believer, as it seems that you are with this piece. And I listened to the Noted podcast, and it seems like you're going to be diving into some other historical stories in the Bitcoin world. I think it's important to create a historical context for people coming in. And I think the P2SH battle that you just wrote about is a very important one, filled with characters that I've respected throughout the years, conflicting with each other, whether it be Luke Dasher, Amir Taki, Greg Maxwell steps in, obviously Gavin Anderson's at the center of it. You have people like Russell O'Connor. Thamos makes an appearance, a couple of miners. It's in a fight for the, I guess, the way Bitcoin has improved moving forward, or this is a precedent to set one way?
Yeah, I would say that, it's kind of touching on a few of the points there. I think that, I do feel passionately about the Bitcoin history, right? So I was a journalist. Most people associate me with, having been the editor for CoinDesk during its formative years. Since moved on and trying to kind of do work, I think that better aligns with, Bitcoin's values, right? Or helping people understand Bitcoin as a movement. I think with this story, in Bitcoin Magazine, it's, the battle for P2SH, the untold history of the first Bitcoin war. It really is like in terms of my own kind of archaeology and looking back, it's kind of the first event in Bitcoin's history where, as you alluded to, and all the characters you named, the community is big enough and there are a diverse set of participants, like the participant pool is large enough where, this is kind of the first, I would say, serious disagreement where you have, if Bitcoin is both a technology and a philosophy, there's, multiple disagreements and like complex disagreements happening at each of those levels. Whereas I think before in Bitcoin history, if you go back, like the events of this article take place, mostly in late 2011 into early 2012, there isn't as much back then, right? The community is really small and in the stages of coming together. And I would say with P2SH, it's the first kind of fork it is the first fork that happens without Satoshi. It's the first modern soft fork that was activated via miner signaling, which is what we still use today. It really marked the division, the beginning of the division amongst the developers who were just kind of coming together to work on the project and their vision for it. And I think in that expression, they found out a lot about what they each thought about Bitcoin, which is something they hadn't discussed before, right? They're just a group of coders working on a project they're passionate about. And here we find that an early disagreement just creates a diffusion of ideas, right? And you get to see who thinks what about the Bitcoin software, including some of the people that we revere today from the history.
Yeah, it's funny, as Amir Taki pointing out, I think what stuck out to me in the beginning of the article was Amir saying this is a $20 million network, and like thinking now it's above 350 billion, and even like $20 million was big to that developer community at that given point in time. And thank God they had this disagreement, right? And cared enough about, at the time, it probably seemed like a large network, but looking back, that's a drop in the bucket of what Bitcoin is today.
Yeah, I think that's what's cool about Bitcoin, though, right? I think we've seen it over time grow. And, speaking of what you were saying about audience responsibility, we also have a responsibility about as Bitcoiners to do, the right thing for the software, right? And I think that we're likely living in a time where Bitcoin is large enough or becoming large enough where it's not going to be as affected by our personal decisions anymore. I think if you look back at the last 10 years, a lot of the formative battles for Bitcoin have likely been fought. I mean, knock on wood, asterisk, in case that comes back. But I think we have a really well-developed idea of what Bitcoin is as a technology and a philosophy. I don't think you could have said that even 5 or 6 years ago. And I do think the effort to preserve these stories is important because as the community grows larger, you deal with this problem of what Greg Maxwell calls social scalability, right? It's like, how do you ensure that the participants within the system all understand it as well and have the same values? And I think what you find if you look back at the Bitcoin history is there are multiple points in time where the community didn't have a strong consensus on its values, or a large portion of the community felt or held different values, right? And there was some struggle or event or in this war, or whatever you want to call it, where those ideologies had to come to a head, right? Ultimately, Bitcoin has to be defined in a certain way. And as much as you want to think about Bitcoin being what you want it to be, it has to be a single thing. So I think preserving the stories about the history, the benefit of that is, you get to go back and really understand what these people thought, why they thought that way. and ultimately build your own idea of like what Bitcoin's like value proposition is and its philosophy. And I feel like that for me has been lacking a lot. Like I think like from my personal journey to become someone who could even plausibly identify themselves as a Bitcoiner is one that took me a long time. And I think, part of that is just, I started writing about Bitcoin in 2013, right? We have a much different idea of what Bitcoin is today than we did back then, for sure.
And was Bitcoin just a beat for you at that point, or were you drawn to it specifically because you had interest due to what was going on?
I mean, I always thought that Bitcoin was a great story, right? So as someone early on, I would say I definitely came to Bitcoin as someone who was creative or wanted to be a writer, right? Someone who wanted to be professionally creative. I went to school. I got a degree in journalism. I wasn't a working journalist then, and I was able to use Bitcoin as a vehicle to become a journalist, right? So I actually got a job as an editor for a payments news outlet called payments.com. It was out of Boston. 3-person outlet. So I was the editor there for a newsletter for a few months, or 6 months to a year. Started freelancing for CoinDesk in the middle of 2013 when it was really just starting, and Bitcoin was really kind of becoming a thing. There was Silk Road, there was Mt. Gox, yada, yada, yada. So yeah, I did my first pieces for CoinDesk over the summer of 2013, and by the winter, I was the U.S. editor of CoinDesk, which was this new news source that was covering Bitcoin and the startups that were being built on top of Bitcoin, right? So yeah, I think that if you look back at that period, I try to say that there's only so much we could have known about Bitcoin, but I honestly don't know that that's true. I think that there's a certain momentum to the present, like at any given time. And the issue with having like a momentum in the present or a deference to the present is that you see through things through that lens, and you don't think anything else, right? So one of the default assumptions of CoinDesk early on was that CoinDesk was TechCrunch for Bitcoin, and we were covering the startups being built on Bitcoin, which was the cryptocurrency protocol that was going to succeed because of its network effects, right? That was the Silicon Valley thesis at the time. Bitcoin was a successful payment mechanism. This was just what you heard all the time amongst a small group of online users. It had value because it was increasingly being used for payments and goods and services. And CoinDesk as a vehicle was very shaped by that ideology that was coming at the time, which is that was how Bitcoin was going to mainstream, that Bitcoin was a, quote, decentralized PayPal or something like that. And, I have often struggled with, and I think came later in Bitcoin history to realize that I should have done a much better job on questioning those things that seemed so inherent at the time, right? Because that's really what you do find with the Bitcoin block size wars and things like that, is you find that a lot of the industry kind of left before it looked in terms of doing diligence on Bitcoin. I still wonder if like the big early investors in Bitcoin like really understand it at all. And I look back and I think that there's no real way they possibly could. I don't understand how they could do that. I think that the best we can do is try, right? We can try to continue to understand Bitcoin. At least I think so. I don't know. I go back and forth on this a lot. I think some people seem to really understand Bitcoin innately, maybe. For other people, it's a journey, maybe. But for other people, I don't know. Like we as humans just didn't really understand Bitcoin that well.
Yeah, I completely agree. There was definitely people in the industry. I mean, as the fork wars proved, people, in my opinion, misunderstood the nature of the protocol, its limitations, more importantly. And
I think it took me so long to understand Bitcoin as a software project. I think this is something I was talking to some other journalists about the other day. And I think Aaron Van Werdum, the co-author of this piece, like he was the first journalist who really understood that. He really took the time to realize the front door is GitHub. You can go in the IRC, you can talk to the developers, you can understand their concerns. And that was a lens that no one else had when he had it. I think I've done my best over the years to try to adapt to that lens, but I was very much came of age, and my incentives, like as somebody who was employed by a company, was to adapt to the view that they had. And I wouldn't say that meant that the information was bad. It was just that it was coming from a certain lens, right?
Yeah.
And look, we may have a lens on Bitcoin today that may in the future also seem the same. And that's the thing that keeps me very skeptical about myself and skeptical about, finding myself in any ideological niche within Bitcoin, right? I think, you can look at the current time period and you can ask yourself, are we over optimizing the idea that Bitcoin is a quote asset? Like, is it an asset? Like, I mean, certainly seems like, you can call it that, but it's attached to this economy, and the economy in in a lot of respects defines the asset, right? Is it really a store of value? Well, I mean, it is now, but and it is mainstreaming on that definition. But will Bitcoin always be only referred to as a store of value? I don't know, right? So I think looking back at that time, and maybe this is like another kind of vote for like why we should maintain the history and kind of keep these learnings around, is that I think we're always all sort of in danger of maybe going a bit too far in our efforts to promote Bitcoin and defining it too narrowly.
Yeah. I like to describe it as like Bitcoin's revealing itself to us. Like it's like you're on a gaming map, and as you reach new territories with your hands out, you're discovering where the walls are. And some people throughout Bitcoin's history have had a better idea of what that map looks like. Good examples: Hal Finney was in December of 2010, wrote about the Bitcoin bank theory, where he just basically described Bitcoin, the protocol level, as a settlement layer, and you'd build layers to enable medium of exchange and payment systems above it, which seems to be a very prescient view of the protocol, in my opinion. And then you have others who just completely try to guess at what the dark spots of the map, the limitations are, and it turns out time tells that it's probably not right. But it's interesting. Like, as somebody who's again bias on the table, full on Bitcoin bull, love the Lightning Network, use it, but like you said, like, is it an asset? Like, I'm using the Lightning Network as a messaging layer right now, like actually sending text messages on Sphinx app, which is an interesting concept. I think
I think you see this with like the division between Bitcoin and Ethereum right now, and what I keep trying to tell people who ask me about that is I always say that I don't think that what Ethereum is succeeding at, that Bitcoin has failed that, and I don't think that Bitcoin has failed at the things that Ethereum has succeeded at. I'm not sure if I said that right, but it's basically like, I think in our efforts to describe these technologies, we often do a very bad job about describing like what they are, right? So Bitcoin, I think, is succeeding as a store of value for a lot of people, and they're using it as an asset. But those terms should not restrict our definition of understanding of Bitcoin. And I think, maybe the issue with that is if you narrowly define it too much, then people don't kind of, continue to develop it, right? So I guess the question would be like, I asked somebody recently, it was, is Bitcoin a platform? Like we call Ethereum a platform because it seems obvious that Ethereum is a platform. People are doing things on top of it and they're launching things on top of it. But Bitcoin is also a platform, right? So I think, again, there's problems with definitions at this point. I think we're, stepping back fully, it's Bitcoin as an innovation, or was an innovation. We as humans are struggling to understand this because it is so groundbreaking. And then derivatively from that, right, it might take time, right? Took a long time from the discovery of flight for us to be flying planes around. And certainly, like, you can go to museums and they're full of badly designed planes. Right. So, but back to your point about like the people who had a really prescient view, I think the article introduces a couple characters who you can go back today and say, wow, like they really had a strong idea of what Bitcoin was.
And I think a segue into the conversation about the article ties neatly to what you just described there. Like, Bitcoin has not failed where Ethereum has succeeded necessarily, but it is on that path to potentially enabling that. P2SH, pay to script hash, is a perfect example of that, because what does that revolve around? The ability to easily create and send multi-sig transactions, which some would argue is the basically basic building block of a smart contract.
Right. Yeah. That Bitcoin has the scripting language, and that's equally important. And I think that's one of the areas of Bitcoin that I'm still trying to understand personally. And I think, the article does a good job of explaining it a little bit, but, there's so many concepts to unpack even in this article and just try and tell the story. But what I was going to say, yeah, I think that the two people who really shine through as having, really prescient views of the network at this early stage would be Thamos and Greg Maxwell, both of whom I think have, great quotes in the piece. And I would say, like, the important thing to remember about the quotes in the piece is, Aaron and I actually did go through the IRC logs, the Bitcoin talk logs, the mailing list, right? Like, oftentimes, like, kind of day by day to look for things. And some of these quotes, like, they're the only times we can see someone mention something like this or talk like this. And I think what was interesting about both Greg and Thamos is at this time, they still, even at this time when, Bitcoin clients, right? Everybody's running the Bitcoin software. You now have two Bitcoin clients. You have a node that's storing a copy of the blockchain and miners competing for rewards. I think Thamos and Greg Maxwell really understood that, it was the nodes within the network that made those decisions, or specifically that it wasn't the miners, right? And you can kind of look at their statements as the early version of figuring out this idea, because I don't think there was a way to know. And this is what I go back to all the time about. You can talk to, is Bitcoin's ideology inherent or was it emergent? And do you care, like, which one it is, right? I think that there are some people who think Bitcoin's ideology was inherent, that the version that we have of Bitcoin, the way we believe it, is what we always should have believed if we were to understand it correctly. Sorry, I'll explain that again. I think they think that Bitcoin is inherent, like their values are inherent. They believe that what we think about it now is how you always should have thought about it. So let me break that down and say, I would ask, like, if that is true, then, like, how is it true that the clients, like the Bitcoin clients, split into two different things, like miners and nodes? And how could you ever have known what to do about that? So if you really believe that Bitcoin's values are inherent, I don't know. It just seems like, well, we know at the beginning that there's no way for that to have been inherent. There was actually no way to describe there being two different types of clients on the network, because no one actually theorized that would happen. So is Bitcoin ideology emergent, right? Did it become about because things happened? And I understand why the idea that Bitcoin ideology is emergent might be somewhat threatening, because it invites the idea that, like, we might have made a choice about something. I actually think that shouldn't be frightening, because we as participants in the system can still make the best choice, right? So if you go back in time and you kind of show that you made the best choice, well, does it matter if it's emergent or not? I don't know. I go back and forth on this, because I do think that oftentimes the Bitcoin ideology is presented today as if it was always fact. And I always like to point out the differential between miners and nodes, because, well, it was a fact at one point that they were the same thing. And that was the vision that Satoshi set out, or, what they wrote in the white paper. So you can draw your own conclusions from that. But, my take on that is I think the Bitcoin technological design and philosophy are a bit more emergent. And I don't think that should be threatening. I don't think that makes our ideology, like, less good. It's just a more accurate statement of the reality that occurred.
Yeah. It's a tough conversation, right? Like, not tough conversation, but, like, it's tough, not tough to digest. It's, like, hard to think through, because, like, there are some things, like Genesis block had a very strong message in it. Is that a inherent sort of ideology built right into the first block? Potentially, some would argue. Others argue it's just simply a timestamp, a headline to prove something happened at a very specific point in time. Could Satoshi?
Well, if it was like $5 off at Denny's, like,
right, right.
I mean, who knows what would have happened? Maybe it would be a food blockchain by now,
Right, and we'd take over IBM and have the food supply chain locked down on the Bitcoin blockchain. But yeah, right. Could Satoshi foresee CPUs evolving to GPUs and now ASICs, FPGAs at some point?
I've actually found some early evidence that he was aware of that, like, more earlier than I thought. So I was scrubbing the archives pretty recently. I haven't gotten a chance to, like, write this down in any form yet. But it seems that by late 2009, he was aware. So this would have been right as the Bitcoin forums were starting. So you have kind of 3 discussion forums within Bitcoin. You have Bitcoin List, which is, like, in 2009. Satoshi just kind of has the canonical list that kind of gets dropped off. And then there's the Bitcoin forum, which is what occurred on bitcoin.org. There was a private chat room, and a lot of that has been ported over to Bitcoin Talk now. But yeah, there's a comment that Satoshi left on the Bitcoin forum where he says to one guy, I can't remember the exact words, but he's like, the guy's essentially saying like, yeah, we should, you can mine with GPUs, like we'll just get way more rewards. And he says something to the effect of like, oh, we should make a gentleman's agreement, like not to do this.
Yeah.
Because it's better for the network. And I was like, oh, that's just like a random thing for Satoshi to say, because it's like, okay, well, it suggests to me that he was aware that like, so this would have been before GPUs were even around on networks. We went from CPUs to GPUs, or was it FPGAs were in the middle, or
FPGAs are between GPU and ASICs.
Okay, so it's CPU, GPU, FPGA, ASICs. Is that our monkeys, evolutionary monkeys?
Yeah, and then I don't know if we'll go. I'm too dumb to know if we'll go. I should know this since I work.
Well, yeah, I mean, he
don't
says
think we're going over ASICs.
I think the point is that like he was aware that it was possible, and then was comfortable deferring to people's personal choice, like that to do the right thing in the network. I just find that's kind of interesting, because I think, that's one of the things we don't know, right? You're sort of left with Bitcoin. The Bitcoin client, as it originally existed, like was supposed to function a certain way. Every member was supposed to run it and was, supposed to conduct a certain amount of activities, right? And that didn't scale. That doesn't necessarily mean that was bad, I don't think. I still think it's possible to think that we made the best decisions for Bitcoin, and that in the Darwinian evolutionary battle of all these ideas, it's likely the best ones won out. But I think we should want to know that. We should actually want to be able to trace that and with some accuracy make that case, right? Yeah. I think you can argue that, or I would certainly make the argument that, given that the client design that Satoshi put forward largely did not work in practice, and you were left with two types of clients, the client that was more easily accessible, like you being a node owner, becoming the dominant decision maker, or the check and balance on the other stakeholders of the network, made sense, because if you had defined the system where miners had the choice and the barrier to entry on being a miner was sufficiently high, then the system wouldn't be sovereign, quote unquote, as we know it today, because you would have been subject to the whims of some other entity who could make decisions on your behalf. So I think if you look at it through that lens, like, I think the right decision was made, but I think you're left like to look and examine the process of like, well, how did that decision occur, and how are decisions getting made within Bitcoin? Because then you're sort of saying that, and I think this is the particular part that people find kind of threatening or scary, is that we would have to talk about Bitcoin as something that we are participating in and are influencing. And I think that does kind of, I've been stating it recently as like, there's this paradox, right? I think we're going to live in a world where Bitcoin is a system that is so large that we can't possibly change it. It's this store of value that is a mathematical law of the universe, the Michael Saylor definition. But it's also going to be true that at some points people had an outsized impact or decision-making, or could have impacted like the formation of that thing, just because it was too small at that juncture to be what it is today. And I don't think that paradox makes either of those things wrong. It actually might make both those things right.
Yeah. So maybe the ideology was inherent from the offset, but the implementation is emergent. Is a way to state that, right? Like the software implementation. Like if Satoshi had "oh fuck" after launch, and Satoshi was obviously fallible. Like the beginning of this P2SH article is talking about bringing back some opcodes, most of which were previously moonlighted because they turned out to be quasi attacks on the network, or attack vectors is a better explanation.
Well, yeah, I think what you're talking about is, emergent versus, inherent. I think it was inherent that the network design was supposed to be open, such that anyone was an equal participant within the network, right? That was, and it was inherent that Bitcoin was supposed to be an alternative to the banking system. And I think that's where Satoshi comes in.
I'm saying, so those are inherent. The hard cap's inherent in my mind. And the concept of one, I know he says one miner, one vote. Mm-hmm. That's what sort of. That's okay. A
lot of dog yapping going on. Sorry.
Yeah, and like Satoshi was fallible. He obviously didn't foresee GPU mining till a post-launch.
Well, that's why I think you have to look at the choice of nodes being sort of given the within the technological design and the philosophy, the position that they were given, because it aligns with the ideology like better, right? So there was basically a choice of whether do miners or nodes have the decision, and if you gave the decision to miners, well, you can obviously see where that is intellectually contradictive to a lot of earlier stuff. Like the technology would have worked, but as a philosophy and a system that had value because it provided a certain thing, it would have broken that.
It's a centralized governance structure at that point, to an extent.
Well, I think that was the argument of a lot of the core developers at the time, and that was kind of the whole legacy of the fork war period. Which I would actually view this P2SH article as, this is kind of the prequel, right? This is where that rift really starts to form. And you're starting to see the different characters kind of line up, in terms of how they'll later oppose each other. I think it's interesting because it's so early at this point that some of those factions are not quite set in stone yet, right? You get to see Greg Maxwell reacting to Gavin Andreessen's contribution and being in awe. It's wow, I can't believe that you would have figured out how to do this.
Pull out the champagne.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you get to see him be pragmatic, be we should move quickly. There's no reason that this can't be done. We all agree on this. Miners are not voting. Users are not voting. We have agreed. You get to see, Maxwell sort of advocating for a speed and efficiency to the process that today would be, unorthodox, right? You would never see somebody within the core developer circle, speaking in that sort of way. So, to me, again, why I find this not threatening and why I think we should engage with it, because it invites us to consider how we've changed over time and whether we've changed in the right ways, right? We can see that people didn't behave that way back then. So I think we have no other choice than to believe that that's how they felt and that they were representing their actions in an authentic way. And that over time, we just evolved the system to be more aligned with our values. And it was a painful process to do that. And I think, you can see all the splinters within the community that have resulted of that. But, I think we're going to have to, at some point, go back and kind of show some of this work because, I don't know, the alternative is that we might lose a lot of this information about these time periods, right? So, going back and look at the fork wars, it's what do we know about the New York Agreement? What do we know about the Hong Kong Agreement? We have to accept that there are these formative events in Bitcoin history that are super opaque. We don't have any insight into what the participants did, said, how they represented the system. And do we want to live in a world where that is the case? My argument is that, Bitcoin as a system becomes more valuable the more you can prove that it made the correct decisions and it's designed correctly. And instances in that history undermine it, very obviously undermine it. I think the lack of transparency about those events is confusing. It's weird. It's a strange thing that occurred. But, again, the other part of it is that, we are all humans participating in the system and our views and values will change. The only thing we can do is make sure that they're changing correctly, right? They're doing so with some greater purpose.
Yeah. No, to my eyes, it seems like we're going in the right direction, compared to the battle over P2SH, which was mainly developers until Amir Taki said, hey, we should open this up to users. Users should really be making these decisions at the end of the day. It shouldn't be minors. Describe the scenario for people who haven't read the article yet, right? It came down to we're gonna let the mining pools decide. There was 4 large mining pools at the time, one of which was a bite ball.
Which one? There was one guy who kind of takes a stand and just refuses to make a decision. Yeah, I love that guy. I'm a big fan of him. But yeah, as you're pointing out, it is you do see governance sort of unfolding in real time to developers who almost don't really understand that you would need governance, right? So what's cool about the article is you get to see these decisions being come to in real time. So the way I like to describe the article is, it's about a group of developers who want to make a really small change to Bitcoin. They want to make multi-sig addresses, which we all use today to secure Bitcoin, easier to use because they're twice the size of regular addresses, and that's just inconvenient, right? If you want people to use more secure addresses, you should want smaller addresses, right? So they find a solution to making the addresses smaller, but through Bitcoin being an open network of participants running code, everyone has to upgrade, right? Or else you end up with two blockchains unless you design it correctly, right? So now we have to deal with, okay, we have the right solution, but the network has to be upgraded to adapt to it, right? So then we say, okay, how do we upgrade it to the network? And it turns out, well, hey, there's all these people running Bitcoin's code. Wouldn't it be super easy? Like we just went to these mining pools who, have all these users and just said like, hey, which one do you want to run? Right. So that you see this sort of, deference to mining pools kind of emerges as a convenience. Like, hey, we've got this great improvement to Bitcoin. Let's get the miners. They're the easiest path for us to get this great thing to the users. Let's go to them. And then you see the mining pools say, well, why do you want to set the conditions where we make decisions? If you, Gavin, and you, Luke, don't agree on what the best software upgrade for Bitcoin is, like why are we somehow making decisions for the network? And then you get to deal with the philosophical decisions on top of that, right? So you really just see that Bitcoin being such a complex system, every small little change sets out this chain reaction. And I think with P2SH, I don't think the participants in that system realized that yet. This was kind of the first event where you saw that a very small disagreement can have ripple effects throughout the network. And because the network is well designed, or designed in such a way where, the component pieces are decentralized, right? Everybody's, Bitcoin market is a, representation of the work of all these, different groups. You really do see that emerge in real time. There was no way for us to know that's how Bitcoin governance worked because no one had tried to do something that was Bitcoin governance, right? Prior to this event, Satoshi made changes and Satoshi was in charge, and that was the governance model, right? So what emerges from that is the process that I think we're still trying to understand today.
Yes, but I think we're getting better at understanding it. Obviously, we had the fork wars, SegWit 2x, another battle in which it was miners versus nodes, right? And it seems that the nodes won out at the end. You had 95% of miners on one side, and yet they weren't able to push that through. And now we have Taproot on the table. And it seems like the miners have conceded they really have no power over this. The developers don't want to make the decision at all. They're literally just proposing like, hey, if we want it to activate it, here's this, that, and that way. And then basically abdicating everything to the users to put it in their hands and make it happen. It's beautiful to see how it's evolved. Especially talking to core devs, like they don't want to put a step forward at this point in time to like be the one to say, hey, here's how we're going to change it.
Yeah, I think that'll be interesting, right? I look at Taproot and I can just see all the ways that it's obviously kind of just following in the wake of SegWit, right? You kind of see that the reluctance of even though most people agree that it's a good change, or that seems to be the case, there's a reluctance to move forward in pushing it through. And I think there's a desire for the community to become more vocal about it, perhaps, and for it to get pushed through that way. But we don't know the best way to make decisions on Bitcoin, I think, at this point. And look, I mean, we may be ultimately in situations in the future where we might have to make decision-making in less than ideal ways, right? We might have to go back and understand some of these previous events and understand how things were done. And in the future, we might also be asked in situations to do things out of convenience that might not be best for Bitcoin. And I think, you mentioned the story of the miner in here, Tycho, right? He was one of the top 3 largest mining pool operators at the time. And what I think is really interesting is that Gavin and Luke Jr. in their disagreement about what was best for the software, they go to the miners to effectively ask them to make the decision. And Tycho says, well, I don't think we should, miners should not decide. Why are you asking me? I'm not a developer. I'm not deciding for anybody, which is the better choice. And I think that instance invites us all to consider, well, how would you have reacted in that situation? We saw in subsequent events in history that some people weren't able to kind of look at the apple, so to speak, and say, no, I'm going to do something that's aligned with the values of the network. But I do think that is something that we will continue to be asked of with Bitcoin, right? I still think it is a system that, not everybody's on the Bitcoin network yet. Right. There's about to be a lot more financial institutions on board as well, right? We might have we might not have seen anything yet, right? There, and that's what I like about the P2SH article. There's like a certain like naive, like quaint quality to it, where there's one passage that I didn't include where Greg Maxwell kind of like, in frustration, he's like, this is, I don't even know why I bother. This is like such a huge disagreement. It's like, I can't possibly continue with this. And you're like, boy, I don't like want to tell you what's happening in 3 years to you, man.
Right.
Like, let me introduce you to Jihan Wu over here.
Right. And then,
so yeah, you get to look at, history kind of has a lot of lessons that are, they're a bit more, softer, I guess, in their instruction, right? It doesn't say like this is the best way or the only way or it's the one definitive way, but I think if you look at these events, I think it's obvious that like Bitcoin has come to decision-making points as a network in its history. It has dealt with them in different ways. And I think hopefully if these events like continue to be preserved, like we can get closer to understanding like how the system should work and how we should want it to work. So yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting going forward. Like you mentioned, as more and more of these big institutions get in, like, will they start funding devs to try to get certain things pushed through? Will they try to use, they're buying tens of thousands of Bitcoin at the time. Will they try to use that clout to direct the direction of the protocol development in a certain way? I wouldn't be surprised. I think their efforts will be in vain. I think a lot of the upcoming battles of Bitcoin are, they're all social, but I think social attacks via the potential bifurcation of the network into a gray market and a white market, if you will.
Yeah, I think you've done a lot more pressing research on the privacy aspect. That's certainly something that I haven't dug into as much, though I am like curious about it, and I do think rightly that there are concerns about that. Right, I think that if the events of Bitcoin's past show us anything, it's that we need to be distrustful of people who are within Bitcoin. And, not to go back to another character in the story, but I think that's one of the lessons with Gavin Andresen, right? And I like to continue to talk about Gavin Andresen because he's become such a forgotten, maligned figure in Bitcoin. For anybody who doesn't know, Gavin Andresen was the successor to Satoshi Nakamoto. He was the person who took over the project from him, and ostensibly, from all the evidence that I can find, with his blessing and without any real other replacement who could have possibly been considered for that. I think he's a story of someone who probably in his mind like thought he was doing the right thing for Bitcoin, like thought he had the right vision for it, and then came into contact with the reality that he didn't. And I think that story is something that I think everybody should identify with, because look, Gavin was he was there when there was worth nothing, and through his own efforts the network became more valuable.
Yeah, I've always found it interesting that he told Satoshi that he was going to meet with the CIA, and then Satoshi bounced a couple weeks later.
I'm not sure how to read that, to be honest. Obviously, one of the things that there's a certain connotation to that fact, right? But we don't really know much about that event, right?
Everybody jumps to spook.
Yeah, I find that event to be really, not to push myself into saying things that will be like unpopular, but I really don't like how that event is portrayed, because I think that it's somewhat disingenuous to say that like we don't actually know, like how can you surmise the motivations of what Satoshi's. Certainly we know that he was planning to leave prior, right? Because he hands Gavin the keys to the project at the end of the prior year, and he does spend some time in the early 2011 coordinating that handover with Gavin, working with Gavin on interviews, right? Gavin becomes kind of the public face for Bitcoin, and maybe this is a coincidence that we're reading too much. And look, equally also, I understand people who are saying, well, I like to say that Gavin is a CIA agent and there's nothing that you can do to convince me otherwise. Look, there's a lot of evidence at the time, if you read through the logs, that was a widely popular decision, and that was supported by a lot of the other core developers. I can't change how you feel about it, but I think that some of these discussions, like based on historical moments, they can have more data and they can be more honest about what the actual events like were, right? We have the transcripts for Gavin's CIA meeting, right? It's all public. You can go see the slides. You can read what he said. It's actually really not opaque event. And yeah, I know maybe that's another thing to kind of pull on as we kind of go back to this history. But yeah, I don't know. I can't say anything more than that. I think we should want to have the facts put together, right? We live in a time where we can still understand how Bitcoin was formed, and that might not be true for people in the future who are coming to Bitcoin, right?
Well, that is a beautiful part of the network. Like you mentioned, IRC logs open, Bitcoin Talk open. You can go back, read through this history, Satoshi's emails, email list open. Why do you think people in the future may not be able to do this? You think this is going to get wiped from the internet if Bitcoin gets too powerful, or
no? I think the allusion here was just to some of the events in the history that we know are important that aren't documented. And I think a lot of the stuff around SegWit in particular, a lot of that took place behind closed doors. A lot of that took place with, either small groups of miners having conversations or small groups of businesses having conversations that aren't public. So, excuse me. Is that good or bad? I mean,
yeah, well,
it's a lot of the thing was lost. So
I remember, well, I actually, maybe for the Hong Kong agreement, that was a closed door meeting. Actually, my first BitDevs meetup that I ever went to in New York was the first BitDevs after the Hong Kong meeting. And Russ Yanofsky is at Chain Code now. I believe he was in attendance, and he gave a presentation on what was said behind those doors. And I actually have notes in my journal.
Oh, really?
Describing. I'll find them and I'll send them to you. But it basically, it's short, he describes SegWit and briefly the conversation with the Chinese miners. So there was an effort, at least from the core side, to try to
that's super
propagate
interesting,
that
right? I think that that's I guess we could talk about why that event is important, but right, you had this idea that a roadmap for Bitcoin was crafted in a private meeting of some core developers and some miners. And I'm sure there are some who would quibble with what I just said, but I don't know how you could feel differently about it.
I'm pretty sure it was the 248 deal, or a hard fork to 2 megabytes, then to 4, and then eventually 8. We're going to get SegWit at some point along that line.
Without going into specifics, I would say that two groups walked into a room. Those two groups emerged with a loose understanding of how they would behave in terms of changing and working together to change Bitcoin. Right. That's why I prefer not to use the word upgrade, because I do think that the objective way to just say it is that anyone who's making any proposals is just trying to change Bitcoin. Right. So two groups walked in a room and they left with a roadmap for how to change Bitcoin. That wasn't an open meeting, and it wasn't something where there was a large contingency of node operators who were invited, right? So the idea, this is another question where is it inherent or is it emergent, right? So the idea that the developers need, want, or think that the network is designed such that node operators in charge, well, did they think it was inherent or is it emergent property? And I think where I sort of become, and this has been something that I've latched onto over the years, is that the third option of those is that it's as a mischaracterization that's malicious, right? And I think that was so hard covering the fork wars as a reporter, is there was very hard to tell when people were making arguments about the ideology of Bitcoin as a philosophy and then Bitcoin as a technology, who was actually representing things correctly, because it was such a complex series of events. So again, I'm not accusing anyone of doing that. I'm just saying that really you're kind of left with it being one of those three things, right?
And I don't want to put you in a weird spot, but I feel like I'll get yelled at if I don't bring up the question. What was it like reporting at CoinDesk on this particular event, considering that Barry Silbert was one of the champions of SegWit 2x?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the relationship with DCG and CoinDesk was very hands-off during that period. I think it's easy to see that certain parties involved in that were busy with other things. We were allowed to cover that objectively, as much as our understanding allowed, right? But I think this is kind of the missing piece that I go back to, is that, of the people who were writing at CoinDesk at that point, there was 4 people. This was in the middle of 2017, where there was 1,000 cryptocurrencies coming online every day. Michael Del Castillo covered business, so he's out. Stan, who's the editor of the block, covered short form news. So it's basically me and Alyssa, right? There wasn't like a super large amount of conversation that was happening as we were trying to just cover the story on a day-to-day basis. I think the biggest thing during that time wasn't the relationship of any entities, which I think all was like pretty public. It's just the amount of time and the ability for you to make decisions while both Bitcoin as a technology was being debated and Bitcoin as a philosophy were being debated, and both sides were making certain representations about that technological and philosophical design as being fact. I would actually argue that given the circumstances, I think CoinDesk did a pretty good job. I mean, you can kind of look at how we covered the events of the time. When the SegWit 2x agreement was reached, the next week we had an article about how the miners felt about it, the devs felt about it, and how the businesses felt about it. You know, I mean, I think we didn't. I think people who want to like kind of throw stones at that period, you know, think about how little understanding the businesses and the miners showed that they had about the network, and then ask yourself like how somebody would have objectively covered that as a journalist. It's shocking that I think Aaron did such a good job like during that period, but again, because I think he understood Bitcoin as a software project, and I think he had you know, done a lot of the prior research that I'm now doing to kind of understand that he had a better handle on the technological design and the philosophical design. And what people were saying was based on past truths and not past truths. I still think that there's work to be done on making the conclusions of that more scalable. But at the time, it was basically non-existent. Like there was no way to understand. And so I guess you can ask yourself this, right? So with the SegWit 2x agreement is like a really interesting period in Bitcoin's history, right? So you have a group of major businesses and major miners who, through the representation of Jihan Wu attending this meeting in New York, ostensibly agree to upgrade, to change Bitcoin, you know, to increase the block size some point later in the year, according to another roadmap. You know, I think that, yeah, again, we don't really know like what the participants in that process like expected. But at the time, you know, was it wrong that they could have changed the network? I don't know. We know now that isn't what happened, right? The UASF proposal was made, and through some trick of events, you know, SegWit 2x lost the support that it had, and ultimately at the date where the UASF was supposed to be deployed, you know, there was no upgrade to 2x. Even then, I think that was actually just an awful explanation that I did of it.
No, I think you did a good job.
But I will, but you know, was it incorrect that they could have changed Bitcoin? I think the answer is no. Like CoinDesk, like we chose not to cover that story. I will say one thing that I can say on record that I think I'm pretty proud of is that we were offered the ability to quote break the news that agreement happened, and we did not. And we declined, and we covered the reaction of the people at our consensus event to the agreement.
Yeah, it's a good move.
And I think that was something where we felt that was a good decision. I mean, we also did issue a recommendation that should have been posted to the mailing list rather than on CoinDesk, which was, you know, our position from like an editorial stance was, look, the core developers have said they're not going to consider any proposal that isn't made to the mailing list. So if you're going to make a proposal to change Bitcoin, knock on the door. So I would say...
And they went and did it on Medium, right?
They did, which was a horrible decision. I honestly think that might have been the worst mistake that they made in that whole process, other than doing it, which was like, you know, if you're going to change Nakamoto consensus, knock on the front door.
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, look, I don't think that they knew or understood. I don't think that absolves them from the issues or errors, but I do think we have to understand it, right? So I think that we all want to act like we would have behaved better in those situations. But like, look at who performed in those situations and what they did. These were people who were beloved. Voorhees was beloved. Charlie Shrem was beloved. Like Barry was beloved. Roger was beloved, right? I mean, you couldn't have gotten more like you couldn't have been more in the club like than being one of those people.
So this is like, God, now let's bring it back so many memories. It goes all the way back to the Hong Kong agreement. So there's 2 years between the Hong Kong agreement and this letter that we're describing.
Hong Kong is February 2016, and New York agreement is May of 2017.
A year 4 months. In between then, you had like Bitcoin Classic, Bitcoin Unlimited, Bitcoin XT. There was a faction trying to push that. Coinbase was Brian Armstrong specifically was always behind those upgrades. So there was these like tremors and shots across the bow leading to SegWit 2x, and that letter we're describing that was posted on Medium in May of 2017 was like the powder keg completely blow up. Like, we're at war now. Like,
I actually kind of look like it. I actually like to divide it in two movements. There's sort of there's the initial, like, Gavin starting to push for, and I'd actually be curious for anybody who's listening, any feedback on this, but this is my mental model of this at this point, is essentially there's two halves to the story. The first half kind of begins with Gavin deciding really on his own to push for the block size to be increased and to start the social process for getting consensus around that idea, which happens in late 2014. You really have a series of, debates amongst the developer group about how that consensus should be reached, what Gavin's authority is within that group, and what is the ability of developer teams to represent what they're doing to the community. And I think that sort of culminates with Bitcoin XT, which is ultimately the rejection that, Bitcoin is subject to a democratic vote, right? Or that there can be multiple implementations that in some way allow a change of Bitcoin to occur as a result of a minority decision, right? Because even when you have two implementations and if majority upgrade to one, and then that, creates new economic conditions for the network, you're essentially still, you have an incomplete consensus. So anyway, there's this, this half of the developers kind of argue about what consensus is, how consensus should be reached, and how changes should be made to the network. And I think that really kind of culminates with, Gavin being then kind of thrown out. At the end of that process, XT fails. There's some other attempts to reboot that process, but it really is the loss of Gavin as an authority figure behind that movement that, sort of crimples it. And then I think the middle point in the story is the Ethereum split, because essentially you have an event where Ethereum has, like, the Ethereum blockchain splits, and prior to that, like, the Bitcoin developers really don't, nobody really knew what it was like for a blockchain to actually split while it was in production. The Bitcoin core developers say, great, this validated all our opinions about what we thought and why this is such a dumb idea. So they do their victory lap over the summer. And then the big blockers just say, well, hey, there's two forks and they're competing in the network, and people are they're competing in the marketplace, and people are making free will choice decisions to participate in one another. Why are we not doing that? So then the second half, I think, is really, and I think it's kind of ironic that Ethereum is kind of like the middle point in that, because I do think that both groups kind of go their separate directions from that, right? The big blockers are really like emboldened by the idea that there's multiple blockchains like working within Ethereum. And I think the second half is like the rejuvenation of that effort, right? You have Jihan and Roger funding alternative developer and teams. Those sputter. There's the New York agreement. But look, there's a lot to unpack there.
There's so much to unpack. It's funny.
And look, I'd love to talk to anybody who was interested in those events or was there or anything. I've been doing a lot of research over the last year or so to really flesh those out. So,
it's crazy, because I was just at that point mainly like 2014, 2015, 2016, just a lurker on Twitter, watching it unfold, and like Bitcoin Talk and then Twitter. A lot of it went down on Twitter, which was interesting. A lot of
I think debates. Like that's another fascinating thing that your listeners may not know, but like Bitcoin Twitter is kind of a weird anomaly from the scaling wars, because I think by late 2015 is when kind of everybody goes on Twitter for the first time, because prior to that in Bitcoin's history, it was really defined by Bitcoin Talk and Reddit were really the large kind of social gathering places. And then it isn't until around the time of Scaling Bitcoin, which was the conference series that was kind of set up to mitigate the tensions between the sides, that's when you start seeing the tweets kind of like going out from different sides, coordinating in real time. And really through that, I think that's where Bitcoin Twitter kind of takes off. There's a reason that some of the old timers are on there. Like I wasn't really on Twitter. Like people didn't really, that wasn't really the main social coordination network.
No, it's just, it's, the whole social aspect of this is so fascinating. Like, it's the first time we're doing this, right, in this way, like at a global scale. I mean, some people would argue Linux came first, and it was very similar but I think the stakes are much higher with Bitcoin, considering it's a network tied to a monetary token, a monetary good that hopes to.
Yeah, I would say I'd say the other side effect of the burying the complexity of these stories is that I think this is one of the things that sort of emboldens the multi-cryptocurrency like movement like as a whole, because I think that amongst like the more like quote unquote intellectuals who engage with our space, like there is a tendency for like, look, if you're a commentator, if you're like a random economist looking at what's going on in cryptocurrency, or you're a journalist looking at what's going on in cryptocurrency, uh, and you don't understand that these are all software projects that are competing for finite developer talents, and like, you know, in a lot of respects, like the, you know, energy of like certain computing, like these are computer networks. It's hard to like wrap your head around those things, and it's easy to come to false conclusions, like that we can live in a world that there'll be millions of cryptocurrencies. I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that. Like maybe we will, but
I don't think we will.
Yeah, it seems increasingly unlikely the more you understand how complex Bitcoin is, why you would ever want to build a system that, you know, has those features. And I think you've seen Silicon Valley go through all of the versions of this, like, right? They thought it was a payment network. Then in 2017, it was a way to fund open source. And well, that's not something you hear anymore. And, you know, these ideas kind of come and go and they die. And I understand why people are dismissive of those who traffic in those ideas, or are sympathetic to them. I still would argue that Bitcoin ideology, it just takes a long time to understand. And I don't think it is very easy to become a Bitcoiner. I think it's easier, right? I think you're seeing a lot of people on board through Twitter, like certainly Michael Saylor is a great example. And, you know, podcasters like yourself and Stephen Livera and Peter McCormick and Dan Helds have all done a fantastic job, I think, at proving that Twitter is now the place where people are onboarding, people are choosing Bitcoin. But I still think, and this is like my one point, is like I still think that the ideology, when I say ideology, I mean the technical design of Bitcoin and philosophical design of Bitcoin, and how accessible it is to understand both of those things. When I say that ideology, like that's what I mean, like how accessible it is to really actually understand both of those things. And I think the answer is it still takes a long time. It took me a long time. I think it takes a lot of people a long time. I think the difference between me and a lot of people is that I didn't stop doing that. So you mentioned like, you know, my personal choices at CoinDesk or other places where I worked in the past. Like I was put in challenging positions where I was forced to make decisions without as much information I would have liked. And I think the choice is I just didn't stop like trying to learn about Bitcoin. I kept doing that. So I continue to be, it continues to be something I'm kind of adamant about, because I think people who are met with that pressure, it's like they should persevere. You can get through that, right? That's you should always try to learn more about Bitcoin and increase your understanding of it. And I think that's a value that everyone should have. Yeah.
And it takes time, years. Like I thought Bitcoin was MySpace in like 2013, 2014. Proof of stake really caught me. Fast transactions, low block times. Like I thought Bitcoin was like, why would you be so slow? Dumb. Why is it consuming so much energy? It takes time, right? And especially if you don't understand software.
Right.
Like luckily for me, like while I was learning about Bitcoin, like during college, was like interning at a hedge fund where like I needed to know how to run software to pull data from places, and so sort of had like a like vague understanding of software, and went to take a boot camp to understand front end development a little bit more, and then worked at a software company, understand back end development. If you don't understand actually how software works, how front ends, back ends interact, and then you take it to a distributed system like Bitcoin, understand how that works and how running that software works and how you change the software, not upgrade. It's hard. And like I got a little tipsy after a hot date last Thursday, and saw Raoul Paul saying that that Ethereum is going to like be the largest total addressable market. And I said, you don't understand software, like if you truly believe that, because it's pretty much evident at this point that the Ethereum project has made trade-offs that aren't advantageous and sort of limit the upside potential that network has. And ETH 2.0, in my opinion, is a Hail Mary that I think is going to be an incomplete pass at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely share my thoughts on Ethereum. I mean, I do think that the thing that I think is not talked about enough about that is that the Ethereum 2.0 is at least an attempt to, we were talking about the clients, right? Like the idea that under original Bitcoin design, the clients were, there wasn't really supposed to be a division between nodes and miners, right? Ethereum 2.0 is at least like it's an attempt to go back and fix that issue by essentially giving everybody the tools to be a node and a miner. I guess like that's the best case that I could make for it. But even then I'm like, okay, well, it might be that even though we don't design the system the way the Satoshi intended, we might have the best version of that system, and that Bitcoin might be working because it is now has those two different types of clients. So I think there's a lot of tendency amongst other cryptocurrency communities to try to solve problems that are perceived problems rather than actual problems, right? So in the case of the issue with the Bitcoin client, like issue, I guess you would call it, it came about over time that the way that Satoshi had theorized that the Bitcoin client would run isn't what happened in practice, because proof of work ultimately made it so that you required more and more computing power to compete for rewards. That means now that we live in a time where we have many people running nodes who are incentivized to keep the network honest and aligned with their values. And we have many Bitcoin miners who are spending millions of dollars a year on real world goods to provide as much security as energy as humanly possible to the network. And it might be that that's the best design, even though it wasn't what quote unquote Satoshi intended. And I think this is where I think Vitalik, I've always seen the design of Ethereum 2.0 as somewhat aspirational, in that all these staking systems is like they're trying to undo this client issue in Bitcoin, because I think that it's again, there is this emergent trend that like there is two types of clients within the Bitcoin network, and there's a view from other software developers to conceive of this as a problem, but that is a subjective decision that they've made, and it might not be true. And I think Tur Demeester has like the best quote on Ethereum, which is like, can you buy a software innovation? Still, I think that was the first thing he tweeted about Ethereum when it launched, and it's still the only like interesting question about Ethereum as a software project right now. It's like, can you buy that innovation, and is that innovation correct? And either or both or none of those things might be correct.
Right? No, yeah, and again, so maybe POS is an attempt to get back to the original one client, one CPU, one vote. There was also a lot of virtue signaling about the climate, and it's becoming more and more abundantly clear that actually Bitcoin may help the environment by consuming energy that would have otherwise been vented into the atmosphere, and then driving innovation around renewable energy production because people are toying with it more. And I think that's something like it was a LARP. We need to go to proof of stake to help the environment. It's becoming more obvious, I think, at least to people in the industry, that Bitcoin may not be as bad for the environment as previously thought. And then you couple that with trying to buy the innovation, which I love that line, is...
I got to work on this line some more, but I do think it is that Bitcoin hasn't failed at what Ethereum is succeeding at. I think it's like a very true thing, right? It's a time preference thing, right? Ethereum has a different time preference than Bitcoin. And I think we have to, as Bitcoiners, continue to say, it's like, well, Bitcoin has not failed at what Ethereum is succeeding at. But
There's
if you
an
flip
order
that,
of operations.
Right. Well, if you flip that question around and you could ask, like, has Ethereum failed at what Bitcoin is succeeding at? And I think there's a stronger case for that. Right. Yes. Bitcoin now has like a network in which all participants, like, the hierarchy of participants is aligned enough, and we know that decision making is being made in a centralized way. So the two questions again are like, has Bitcoin failed at what Ethereum is succeeding at? No. Has Ethereum failed at what Bitcoin is succeeding at? It looks like that the answer to that might be yes, but
yes. They have to make ETH 2.0 to be successful. Like that proves like you have to create a whole new network. Like it's like not even a question. It's and so I mean the freaks who are listening to this, well, maybe you're a new freak. Welcome if you are. I've said this before. Like ETH 2.0 is, and this was a concept that was first described to me by Elikai Turkel, Bitcoin core dev. It's a run-of-the-mill, like classic second system syndrome problem, where you have this one system, it has some problems, and you think you can fix all of them with a completely separate new system, and you just turn into a shit show of a project that has numbers of delays, and it just keeps getting delayed till it never comes to fruition. Which ETH 2.0 and so ETH 2.0 started out as a transition to proof of stake. So I just view ETH 2.0 as the goal being transition to proof of stake, and that timeline started when ETH launched. I believe before they even launched, they said, hey, within 18 months we're going to transition from proof of work to proof of stake. So that was the first deadline, and that's just been pushed back and back and back. Like the beginning of the beacon chain was supposed to launch January of this year. It didn't happen until a couple weeks ago. So
yeah, I mean, I go back to that. I would say that kind of the like things that history reveals things. One of the things I was struck by recently, and I've tried to keep like bringing it up in my head to see what value I get from it, but it appears that like Bitcoin didn't really have a coordinated development community like prior to it reaching $1. And like, that's kind of astounding. And that's actually like, if you look at all cryptocurrencies, and this is definitely true of Ethereum, where they've again, the smart investors will always say, oh, there's so many developers building on Ethereum. Well, you look at the history of Bitcoin and you can see that before mid 2011, there's no mailing list. There's not really a group of developers like working in any coordinated fashion. There's a leader who's leaving and somebody else is coming on, and there's a few people working on it. But even then, the idea of Bitcoin and the economic network, the actual value of the network, like Bitcoin had reached $1. Like on the strength merely of its original design, it had gone from 0 to $1, which if you look at the step functions that, Plan B and those people, it's a massive step function, massive. And to think that wasn't the actual product of software innovation from developer teams actively working on it, well, what are you left with this thesis? And I think it's the lack of accessibility to Bitcoin's history and the lack of like the way that we've been able to like explain some of these things, I think has created this environment where these other, not saying that they wouldn't be around, but I think it would be harder for them to exist because they'd have to like more clearly define like why they exist in some way. Whereas right now, I've kind of developed like this idea of what Bitcoin is as a philosophy. And it's, to me, it's like Bitcoin is sovereign. The node is the vehicle by which that sovereignty is expressed. The soft fork is the preferred method of updating Bitcoin because to do a hard fork is to disenfranchise the sovereignty of people who chose one of the first two things. And then fourth, like the sound money principle, like that Bitcoin enforces the economic conditions under which sound money would be possible, thus leading to the success and propagation of the network. Like those four things, like Bitcoin is an incredibly well-designed philosophical system. And if you try to break down Ethereum or another cryptocurrency like along those lines, I think you just find some holes. Like, so what makes you a participant in Ethereum? It's like, is you run a wallet? Like, I don't like, do I have a MetaMask? So like I'm a participant in Ethereum. Like, I don't really understand. Is Ethereum sovereign? Like, is it like, what's the design goal? It's a platform. Or like, the hard forks and soft fork. Okay, so hard forks are good because I can, as a user who has a wallet, do what exactly? Like, what's the, like, I don't know. I just like, I like that framework because I kind of like, the more I run other cryptocurrencies through it, I'm like, okay, well, you don't really seem to have the same robust ideology that Bitcoin has. So that either means that Bitcoin's ideology is wrong or that it's right. And it's just the best version of that could exist. I think the thing that's sad is like, that's not easy to understand that, to get me to the point where I could actually say, okay, these four things, like kind of, this is what I think Bitcoin philosophy is now. Like it took so long to understand that. And I think they don't understand that, right? Like, cause we've seen these groups, as we've been talking about through this whole discussion and going back to the article, which you can read, it's, people confronting Bitcoin and their infinite humanity, like behaving like humans, right? Just doing dumb things.
Yeah. We do dumb things as humans. It is, and that's always something I ponder is at what point does Bitcoin as a software project get to a point where it's so established? It's like, all right, it's here. My kids are going to use it. My grandkids are going to use it. Let's stop quibbling over these flipping narratives and all that stuff.
I think what we will find is that Bitcoin will continue to exist in an adversarial environment. And I think the greatest gift that the people who have come through the Bitcoin history have given us, it's to be skeptical and to constantly question like why we believe certain things. And I think if we fall out of that, that's where we will, again, Bitcoin will always constantly live in an adversarial environment.
Yeah,
always.
That's why I was interested to say that in the beginning of this conversation, Greg Maxwell and Thamos stick out to you particularly, because I thought Amir Taki actually was the hero of this story in my mind.
Well, he is in that I think like Amir, if you read this story, like he says the things that we would say now.
Yeah.
Like at every time where someone should say them. And it's interesting to think that he was such an outsider figure there, right? So to me, I think this proves that like, look, individual people did have an impact on Bitcoin and they did help lay down some of these philosophies, right? I think the idea that Bitcoin is sovereign and that its users like have some rights to participation in the system is kind of a mere talky thing, right? The idea that reading this article, right, you can see that Luke Jr. is one of the first ones who asks like what philosophical like motivations should developers have, and like he essentially runs the developer decision-making process through the prism of like how it differentiates from central bankers making decisions. And like no one else did that from what I can see. So you're left with like, okay, well maybe it is somewhat of a unique distinction to Luke that he was able to see and articulate that. And I think that, the system didn't invalidate it. Right. That was the important part. The important part is that over time, everybody who's like running the numbers on these ideas, like they couldn't invalidate what he said, which means that I think we have a system within Bitcoin where, knowing that, like as the story shows, that these ideas were under as much pressure as they were, and that they were attacked by authorities within the system, yet they persevered, would tell us that the anti-fragility of Bitcoin is strong, right? It's an anti-fragile system, even to people and ideas, where they could have easily not continued. I do like Amir in the piece. I don't mean to say that I don't like Amir in the piece. I think he comes at the right time with like the right things for sure. And ultimately, look, he does argue for there to be a deference given to Luke, and he does argue for the slow and kind of painful developer process we have today. And I think that's, those are good things. But yeah, I think, look, there's a lot of characters in the piece where I was able to come away, and this is really what I wanted to kind of express with the work. And, kind of saying that I'll be moving forward in this direction for some time is like, I think we should ask ourselves like about these choices, right? There's a reason that like cultures over time develop history. I was talking with Dan at Kraken the other day about this, and I was saying that Dan is like the Bitcoin dream. He's out there telling you to set up a shack in the frontier and like get beaver pelts, like, because you're in America, man. It's like freedom. It's like here's America has the American dream, right? The Bitcoin, we have the Bitcoin dream, right? That's what we need to sell, this idea that Bitcoin is the new frontier, right? I think Balaji actually has kind of memed this a little bit with his like Bitcoin as a
with exit.
Yeah. But like, I do think we also need a robust like understanding of our past. And I think America, like as a system, if you want to look at it, it's like, you can go back and you can look at the founding fathers and you can understand like what they thought and how they disagreed, and like how their disagreements made democracy like a developed ideology. And
do you think about the parallels between the founding fathers and Bitcoin? Like, is Bitcoin talk our federal?
And I think the lack of that is like a real issue, right? I saw like, so personal story, like my wife is she's Quebecois, so she's from Canada, and she really got into Hamilton like over the summer, and she was able to kind of come to this idea of America through our understanding people who contributed to it, right? So you're able to kind of learn about Hamilton, and then you can watch the John Adams miniseries, and then you learn about John Adams, and you like learn about Washington, and you can see how again, like they didn't always agree. Some of them had very sharply different ideas on what they were building was, but that there's a certain scalability to the American ideological system because it's well understood, and we allow for these disagreements and we celebrate these figures that disagree. So with Jefferson and Hamilton being like kind of the two polar opposites, within Bitcoin, I think we have figures who like meet those descriptions, right? I think it takes a long time to understand like who those people are and to properly honor them. And again, I think with this, one of the reasons I took so long to write this work, I think, as I've mentioned, I've been kind of like researching in this area for like probably about a year now. It's kind of like the first thing I've pumped out is that, I think that getting the context right really matters. We need to do this right. I agree. But I think the value, again, is that we can create the conditions under which people can come to these ideas and they can feel more personal. An idea that you come to on your own is always going to be more personal than something that somebody memes like you. That's my feeling, at least anyway.
No, I agree. Yeah, it's important to know this stuff. That's why I recommend. It's like when somebody's first getting into Bitcoin, I send them to Satoshi's emails and old Bitcoin Talk forum threads.
It's really amazing that stuff exists. To be honest, the more that I've been working with that stuff, it's absolutely astonishing the amount of information we have on Bitcoin's creation. And I think that's the other cool thing about the article, is that it's the first time I think that there's been a significant usage of it. Because I mentioned me and Aaron kind of went through the IRC, we went through Bitcoin Talk, we went through the mailing list. There's a good amount of stuff there. I mean, I will say my document, like each of those documents was like 100 pages of like random notes, and then it gets distilled to something. But, look, I think that's valuable, right?
Tying it to the founding fathers, these forums are like the Federalist Papers of our time, right? Like where these debates are happening.
Well, I certainly think so, because they certainly
Federalist Papers were anonymous too, to an extent, weren't they?
Well, again, like I think so, because they don't seem to be going away, right? Like that's the thing. Somebody joked on Twitter after reading this article, they were like, "Oh, I can just see somebody writing a thesis about Luke Jr.'s like stance on P2SH in some like college class." Well, it's like, well, we write about 17th century British law like right now, so like, I mean, how like as American kids, like so what? I mean, is that really so? If the system we're building is that strong, then like that will happen. Like then we will have to do that.
Yeah, I had to Control F to get the name right, but some people would argue that check hash verify actually probably would have been a better decision than PTSH, right?
Yeah, the consensus today. Well, I think that's the interesting parable with P2SH is that there were two proposals. There was P2SH, which is Gavin's proposal, and CHV, which is Luke's proposal, which interestingly is just another version of P2SH. This is one of the things where Gavin was a little savvier sometimes with branding and getting his message out there than Luke. But yeah, now like developers will largely say, had they been given enough time, they think that Luke's proposal would have won out. So we're given a situation with this P2SH story where it seems to be that the assumed authority of an individual influenced an outcome in a way that core developers now think like would have not been the right decision. And that invites us to consider that is how the Bitcoin system was then. And, has it changed now, right? Is it at a higher level of scrutiny that we want it to today? And has it changed for the better? Certainly I had always heard that about P2SH, right? I'd always heard that these things were true. I think the difference now is like, if you really want to know about it, you can go back and read it and you can see the theories and see what people argued. And to me, that just means more than just being told what to think about something. But, so don't trust, verify, right?
Well, it's exactly what I was just going to say.
Yeah.
It's like there's so many levels of abdicating trust to other people within the Bitcoin system. Like I understand software, but I can't read the code and dissect it and understand what it's going to do. So I do have to trust the developers to a certain extent, but to the extent that you don't need to trust things by being able to go back and read this open history, you should definitely verify on your own. I completely agree with that. And hey,
yeah, I hope somebody who reads this, like, they can find the links. Like, I mean, we tried to like really link to all the relevant IRC discussions, so you can kind of go back and like read it yourself. Like, I mean, I think you can spend some time like kind of going down. I've heard some of the other developers have said to me that they've done that and kind of looked at some of the threads. And I think, yeah, it's that collective, the hive mind, right? It's like we need to, the more of an understanding we have of this stuff, again, I think the more confident we can be in Bitcoin. And I think that to me, it comes from a desire to be more confident and to prove that things happened like absolutely, right? And I just think like, coming out of that fork war period, it's like, I wasn't convinced of that. And I don't know who would have been, if you were a participant in that, because, it's a part of the history where there's a lot that just seems like it's been allowed to be swept in the back of the closet
Right.
for whatever reason.
Well, now we have more eyes on it. And that's like, again, so I go back and forth to be interested to see how you view it, but I write the bent 5 days a week. And again, it's like a journal of what's going on sometimes in the macro landscape. I talk about Bitcoin development when there's something exciting to me and sort of a snapshot of what went on one particular day through my lens. So I don't know if I'm definitely not preserving history. I'm a secondary source, right? I'm not a primary source. And how does that fit into everything? Like you mentioned before we hit record, you like to talk about like the Bitcoin podcasting space and how that's exploding. It's out of a demand for education around this and how much.
Yeah, but I think we have to remember that like people are people are going to be profit motivated, and their motivations are going to extend beyond Bitcoin. And I think that there's a takeaway to it. It is still that distrust and that questioning, it has to extend to the social circles, right? So as we go into another period where, look, I think we're all expecting Bitcoin to have a huge year next year. We're all excited that there's going to be a number of institutions coming in. And participating in the ecosystem. But let's be on guard because, we've seen these situations happen before where Bitcoin has been defined too narrowly as like a payments network. So are we defining Bitcoin too narrowly as a store of value or as an asset? We've seen situations before where profit motivated actors like can use their positions in the network to try to enforce change. Is it likely that the number of those people will like those profit motivated actors will increase in the coming year? Likely.
Most definitely.
Let's not, I think like, we're all excited about the continued economic growth of the Bitcoin network, but, again, for people who haven't been around for one of these eras, I think like this P2SH article shows, and, what we've been alluding to about the 4 course period is that there's nothing that guarantees the present now from being free from the sins of the past.
No, I agree. No, that's going to be an uphill. Yeah, is Bitcoin just an asset that should be held, just sit somewhere, accumulate?
Well, you
value?
mentioned Amir Taki. I mean, he's probably one of the biggest critics of Bitcoin right now, and I think he's largely been somebody who, the industry has kind of stopped looking at. But I thought it was ironic that you thought he was like so he had so much foresight back then.
I'm an Amir stan. I don't completely agree with everything he says these days. I understand his frustration because of just his personal belief in what he was trying to do at Rahova when he was there. He needed a certain type of utility from Bitcoin where arguably it just wasn't, again, going back to the order of operations, just wasn't completely ready yet, and that could be frustrating, especially for somebody who's
back to your
founding
fathers thing. I like to look at Amir and Gavin as sort of like the two kind of warring fathers of Bitcoin. Like I think the fork wars kind of rendered each of them as being like Bitcoin didn't need them anymore, but they were sort of the original yin and yang of Bitcoin, right? Where you had Gavin, the stay-at-home dad, who wanted Bitcoin to be a respectable thing that businesses were built on, and that I think the Gavin version is the platonic, version of Bitcoin as something that would have been accepted in the world because it was good for all, right? There's a kind of innocence to Gavin as a person, and I think his vision of Bitcoin was innocent. And then there's the Amir Taki version, who's like Bitcoin as the anti-state tool, like we should be anonymous and like we should be actively destabilizing like the world order, which is like later, like Amir is not there yet in the story, but I think it alludes to like the later Amir Taki years where he's literally doing that and like running around in Texas with AK-47s and things like that. I think they're kind of like there's a certain duality to them, right? And I think the interesting thing is that Bitcoin chooses neither of them.
Right.
But I think it has chosen to be more. I think the version we have of Bitcoin is indebted still in some ways to both of them, right? Like Bitcoin does reject both of them, like as like at some point they just become too locked in their own vision to be useful for Bitcoin, and they kind of fall out of the framework. But
I think they could be both. It could be both. It could be all these things. Again, it's just going to take time. It's going to take an order of operations. And I can see the institutional treasury asset store value narrative creeping, and they'll probably fight to make it that way. But then And you're talking to one of the biggest Lightning Network bulls in the world right here, I'm pretty sure. And like, I use the Lightning Network every day. Like, I get utility out of using Bitcoin as a medium of exchange. And like, and again, like with the messaging apps, like, is that a medium of exchange? Like, is that a messaging network?
Well, I think maybe to go back to what you're saying, I think like we all also have to figure out how to use our skills for the benefit of Bitcoin, right? We have to like kind of realign ourselves towards that. And I think with this article, I think personally, like I was very frustrated within CoinDesk, right? I think like certainly to the extent that CoinDesk became the institution that it is, like a lot of that was due to like, you know, my work in that and like making that a thing. But I ultimately feel like a lot of that work doesn't stand up now. Like there's no reason for you to continue, like to go back to that, to the work that I did. And whereas I think with this one, it's, you know, I've gotten closer personally to alignment of like, okay, what am I good at as a human? And like, how am I able to do that for Bitcoin? I think this is the first thing that I can say. And it's crazy. Like I've been employed in the cryptocurrency industry for close to 8 years. And to say that I've
very few people that can say that.
What do you say?
So there's very few people who can say that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, but like to think that it would take me that long to get to the point where it's like, okay, I think this is like the first thing that I've written where it's like, I could see people reading it in like 5 years or 10 years and like coming away with something. And I feel good about that. You know, it's first step, probably going to take a break from the podcast circuit for a while and keep working on it. But, you know, I did want to surface what I'm doing because I do think that this is going to require, like, if we're going to do it for other parts of the Bitcoin history, or certainly ones that are more contentious. Like I think P2SH is, you know, not super contentious in retrospect. But, you know, I do feel like we can do more work here to make the Bitcoin ideology more scalable and to understand in more detail the events that shaped Bitcoin. And I think you can make the argument that these events and people did shape Bitcoin. And if we end up not understanding that, I do think we'll lose something.
I completely agree. And I got a couple more topics for you to cover. I'm sure you already thought of them, but like the bugs, like the overflow bug from 2011, the hard fork in 2013, and then the CVE bug in 2018. I could help you with that story.
I'd be happy. Yeah, we should chat about it. Yeah, I mean, I think there's plenty of drama in Bitcoin's past, right? Without creating some new drama.
Well, that particular weekend we were going to is the HODL conference in Riga, and I just so happened to be on the same flight as Matt Corallo, and he was literally like writing the post to the mailing list, like describing the bug and like pushing code to like patch it, I believe. Wow. And I'm like sitting there, 2018, I believe. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
And like I'm watching Matt like dealing with probably like one of the biggest events in Bitcoin history in person. He was just like cool, calm, and collected.
That's crazy.
Sitting on his laptop on the floor in an airport, and I'm like, "Oh, you want a beer?"
That's a great story, man. Yeah, and look, I think like those guys, you know, it's like, you know, we do owe them a lot, right? Like the developers have really, you know, they've kept Bitcoin going, and really, you know, I think the more that I study the Bitcoin story, the more it is within Bitcoin development is an act of preservation, whereas within cryptocurrency development is an act of like bravado or like innovation. Like Bitcoin is about preservation. Like inherently, the developers were always asked to preserve Bitcoin because Satoshi left, and like so the default way they acted towards it was like nobody wanted to be the one to mess it up, like because it was working. And if there wasn't a great argument that it was broken in some way, you just preserved it because it wasn't yours. I think the other cryptocurrencies don't have that value set, and they adopt a more, you know, it's like innovation for the sake of innovation. It's innovation for the sake of competition. But yeah, Bitcoin is the story of an innovation being preserved, not really made, I think.
No, I love that. And that gets to the slow and steady versus move fast and break things mentality that a lot of people don't understand. Again, comparing Bitcoin to VC culture. It's hard to compute for some people, especially like in an era when Bitcoin came up, which is like VC tech, like apps were just like, that's when they had their glow up, if you will, and sort of dominated the conversation and mind share around technology, these unicorn apps and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I think some of the story is still unfolding, right? I think the biggest narrative right now, I think, is the economics of Bitcoin. I'm continually shocked by the lack of any real writing about this in any of like the crypto, now many crypto news outlets or other things, where it's like how little we actually understand about how the economics of Bitcoin. We're on the verge of watching Bitcoin look like it's going to hit a new. It looks like it's going to set a new all-time high 4 years from the previous time that it did that, 4 years from the previous time it did that, and in each of those three cases, it's exactly mathematically equivalent to how far away it was from the having on each of those times. So the fact that there's so little intellectual brain power being put into understanding okay, you're going to tell me the third Bitcoin bubble is a bubble? How is that possible? How is that even humanly possible that you could believe a third Bitcoin bubble that everyone within Bitcoin is predicting and will probably happen is a bubble? At that point, you're dealing with some part of the system that we don't know or understand yet. But yeah, I don't know. Again, I think that it's hard to come to Bitcoin with open eyes and without prior thing. We all bring so much baggage to Bitcoin, and collectively too. That's not like individually we do it, but also collectively. So
Yeah, and this would be the fourth bubble technically, right? Because I believe it went to like 11 cents, then crashed below a penny at one point, and then or 13
yeah, but the
cents or something like
2011 one is prior to halving.
that. Okay.
So it's weird. Like it's hard for us to know. Yeah, this is where I think it somebody with some mathematical degree that isn't me should study this. But
All we have is Plan B right now. The
well, the
and he's
question that
very
I keep asking
controversial.
myself is if Bitcoin hits a new all-time high next December, let's just take a hypothesis. Let's just take a scientific hypothesis. If Bitcoin hits an all-time high in 2021 December, and its previous all-time highs were December 2017 and December 2013, how is it possible? And this is what I've argued until I was I had a recent argument with one of the editors at the block, and I was like, how is it possible that there would be, if you believe that Bitcoin is purely a function of there being of consumer sentiments and demand, then how is it possible that there are three bubbles that occur mathematically equidistant from each other with precision? At that point, how is Bitcoin volatile or speculative at all? It has to be at that point it's just actually mathematically precise. It's volatile, it's predictable and cyclical. It's not stable, but predictability and cyclicality are in a sense stability, because if you know that something is going to be predictable, it is in effect stable because you can make choices around it. All this is to say, I think that we're going to happen on a big test over the next year of Bitcoin's economic power as a unit. And I think the sheer brute force of how the halving impacts its economy. And I think we should keep that in the back of our minds, where it's if it is true that Bitcoin is mooning, or I don't know, again, increasing in value at a mathematically precise rate, that's crazy.
Yeah, it's insane. And what if it doesn't happen? That's one thing. What if we just hover at 20,000 for the next year and a half? How does that change people's perspective of Bitcoin? Are these bubbles necessary to build the confidence for Bitcoin to succeed? I've always described the price, particularly the bubbles, as just an index of confidence of Bitcoin at any given point in time.
Well, I think I agree with I've come to more agree with the speculative attack model from Pierre, because I think with myself personally, one of the reasons that I became such a staunch Bitcoin over the years is I was economically penalized for non-participation. As a journalist, I didn't invest in what I was covering because I didn't want to have a conflict of interest. So I was economically.
Let's dive into that.
Huh?
Let's dive. Why is that something in the journalism space?
There are still fierce debates about this. There was recently in the cryptocurrency journalist organization forum, the no coiners were very staunchly throwing a lot of tantrums about how there wasn't enough reporting about how Bitcoin is a Ponzi scheme, which
it's not a Ponzi scheme. Ponzi scheme needs a leader. All right, next question.
So my point was okay, well, if you believe that, then why aren't you writing stories about them? And then how are you proving that other than just yelling it on Twitter all day? But look, journalists, again, like that ideology comes from trying to make you get into the idea of objectivity, right?
Yeah, so Matt and I had this discussion on Rabbit Hole Recap the week before last, but wouldn't forcing journalists forcing their hands and not allowing them to invest in the asset make them bias the other direction because they're watching this price appreciation and they're not allowed to participate, and then they just get inherently salty?
I think there's a lot of I think there's some evidence to that to suggest that, right? I think I don't know. I think this comes from the idea that and not to like kind of start like another thread that I've been on lately, but there's this idea of objectivity where it's like you should try to be free from bias and then present both the facts of both sides. Like it's kind of like one of the default lenses of journalism. There are other lenses. There's not. Journalism has many schools, right? So someone like yourself, or I don't know, a podcaster in the industry, you might identify more with like it's called the new school of journalism. So this would have been like Hunter Thompson or Tom Wolfe or somebody like that. Who
love Hunter Thompson.
Yeah, and Hunter Thompson strongly objected to objectivity, right? Like his point of putting himself in his writing was that you can't be anything other than yourself, and then the way that he did his writing was that he used himself as a character to kind of prove his journalistic points. So yeah, that is one school. I think the markets like cryptocurrency has been sharply defined of late by markets journalism, and therefore it defaults to this view that all cryptocurrencies are essentially the same in the way that all stocks or bonds are the same, which I think that's the highly problematic part. Is I think most of the crypto journalism outlets have largely stopped viewing them as competing software projects and now view them as like competing numbers within a terminal. I think that is really bad.
Yes, I agree. And proves that a lot of these people don't understand software and the inherent limitations and mechanics of these systems.
Well, I mean, it is true that most cryptocurrencies continue to have a non-zero value. That doesn't make all cryptocurrencies Bitcoin. I think you can argue that Bitcoin is by every conceivable metric, infinite, like much larger system. You do still have to square the circle at some point of that. Other cryptocurrencies have a non-zero value. The best that I can say for them is that they have a non-zero value that seems to be continuing for much longer than any of us can reason. I think what we'll ultimately find is that they're tracking Bitcoin, and that Bitcoin is the unit that is moving everything. Like Bitcoin is the sun in the center of the universe of cryptocurrencies, and it is the gravity of Bitcoin that is pulling the other things up and down, rather than the other things being inherently separate. Because if they were truly differentiated, and there were many attempts post 2017 for different like research organizations or news outlets to come up with some theory, like, or like way to classify them, right? CoinGecko had like the 5-point developer score system, like, and then the social scores, and like CoinDesk had like something about like that. So there has been many attempts to try to articulate why that thesis would be correct, and I'd argue that they've all sort of died. And I think the only real conclusion you can make is that, like, yeah, Bitcoin is the thing that continues to Bitcoin has an economic power, like there, because of the halving and because of the software programming of Bitcoin, like, this is the Pete Rizzo speculative attack thing, is like Bitcoin ensures its own success, and it actually attacks the financial system by becoming more valuable. And therefore, like you are economically penalized through non-participation in the Bitcoin network. And I continue to say it like this because that's the thing that did it for me. It was that the realization that I was being economically penalized for non-participation in the market, or even conceiving of that. You're like, shit, I'm economically penalized for not being the Bitcoin economy is rewarding users at a vastly more competitive rate than the traditional economy. However you want to say it, you can say this like same thing in a number of different ways. It all equates to the same thing, which is that the Bitcoin is succeeding, like, as a monetary system by getting people to join it. And that if you were actually if you were as a participant between the two systems, if there's one obvious choice, then you will continue to make it, right? That's kind of if anybody hasn't read Speculative Attack, like Pierre Richard's article, it's very good. Timeless piece. Yeah, and it kind of gets into some of this.
Yeah, so I I mean, the Michael Saylors of the world, when he initially announced his first purchase in August, that signaled to me that we're transitioning from the slow bleed to the full-on currency crisis.
Well, and I think I would offer this like last note, like people, is that I think we're going to be surprised by how quickly the system becomes adversarial against us. We, in some ways, I think we will look back and we will find that we had it easy, right? Like we all got to like laugh and joke about like how well Bitcoin is doing. At some point, like like if Bitcoin is as successful as a system, and you saw this with the Stable Act, right? Like where they might, there's concerted attempts to try to outlaw node ownership on some idea that the current law, makes that plausible. I mean, if you think you've seen a tax from the state, like in Bitcoin, I mean, we have not, and it's likely that those will be exceptionally painful. I wrote a tweet that I didn't send the other day, where it was like, shout out to Bitcoin Anons, like because like the Bitcoin Anons have like largely hated me, I think, for the years, mostly because of my work at CoinDesk and for other things. So I think I'm finally making some inroads there. But I wonder now if like anyone other than Bitcoin Anons is taking Bitcoin seriously enough. I don't think, I think that when shit really comes, like the people who like chose to be anonymous in 2011 and 2012, like you had to really know what was coming. And I don't look, I think it's going to be a thing. It's going to be hard for you to be a Bitcoiner amongst your friends and family. They're going to try to turn those people against you. Like, dude, you're not even we're not even there.
Right. All right. Well, I go back and forth. I mean, obviously, I write about Bitcoin at this podcast. I got my face out there. I work.
Well, all right. So if I want to end on one note, like actually, so Johnny, was that Johnny from Blockstream? What's his name? This is killing me because I love Johnny. Johnny Dilly.
Johnny Dilly, yeah.
2 questions he asked me were very formative in becoming a Bitcoiner, and I think I became a Bitcoiner partly because no one else had asked me them. He's like, think about your decisions based on whether you are a good steward of Bitcoin or not. That was like number 1. Are you a good steward of Bitcoin? Are you a good steward? And the second one is, would you die for Bitcoin? Which is like, I don't know. I was asked that when I was 27-year-old reporter, writing on this thing. I was like, oh, I don't think I would die for Bitcoin. But we have, somebody has to. Because that's what it is, right? So anyway, I asked those 2 questions because I find myself thinking more and more about them. I think I've chosen to reorient my life in a way that would make me a better steward of Bitcoin. The second question of would you die for Bitcoin?
No question. Yes, I would rather not, but I think I would. Well,
again, I mean, look, there are, going back to history, just to bring it all super full circle. I mean, it's not going to be us sipping pineapple coladas, when this stuff happens, right? I think if there is something that we can do now, it's probably to be mentally prepared, right, for what might happen. And look, I could be wrong. Like it could all go very easily, and the traditional financial system could just fall away to the economic superiority of Bitcoin, which is an alternative system that they don't control, and then they have no, it could all be so simple. But
life doesn't usually work out that way.
Mm-hmm.
Life doesn't usually work out that way, or at least these big tectonic shifts.
We'll see. I mean, look, it may be that the Bitcoin incentives are so strong that there is no attack on it and everybody just capitulates, right? It's plausible.
Yeah.
I don't look, again, I think that Bitcoin I think we're going to find over time that Bitcoin is something that we have to protect, and that the level of protection that it requires from us is likely to be sufficiently larger than we can predict,
or we'd ever hope was needed. But it is no, ask yourselves that, freaks. Would you die for Bitcoin? Is it that important to you? Are you here for the tech? Or are you here?
Are you going to go down with the ship? That's the question,
All right. I mean, it's imperative. It is an imperative technology in today's day and age. Many people have come on this podcast and described that their lives before discovering Bitcoin were very pessimistic, and Bitcoin is one of the sole reasons for optimism in the future, to avoid the Orwellian dystopian hellscape that we seem to be barreling towards. Hopefully these people in charge are just too old and they fucking die and we don't have to fight them too hard. We'll see. The intelligence agencies like their power.
Let's just hope where there's not some future kangaroo court where that quote is like played back at you.
Well, it's going to be out there. So, yeah, prepare to die, freaks. I guess we'll end it on that.
Sufficiently positive.
Pete, where can we, it's been a fascinating conversation. Almost 2 hours. Where can we,
crazy.
What can we expect from you next? I know we can go to Bitcoin Magazine to find your latest article.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm really dedicated to like working in this area. I'm surfacing this article because I'd like to do more of it. I'm serious about trying to preserve some of the history and the diversity of this Bitcoin history, right? The kind of lovely cornucopia of ideologies and competing visions that have surfaced around it. So yeah, anybody who would like to talk to me about that, you can get in touch with me on Twitter or you can email me. It's at PeteRizzoWrites at gmail.com. Or Pete at BitcoinMagazine.com. So yeah, I mean, look, anyone who wants to have a conversation about the past of the Bitcoin, love to chat.
Pete, thank you for your time. Thank you for the article. Again, if you freaks haven't read it yet, go read it. How the scrolling up to the title, The Battle for P2SH, The Untold Story of the First Bitcoin War. Go read it. Follow Pete on Twitter. We'll link to all this in the show notes. Peace and love.